Let's spend a few moments looking at steps in a program development. So here in Notepad, I've made a few notes. I want to write a program that will play a game, for lack of a better term. And the object of the game is to match or guess the result of a coin toss. So number two, the program will use its built-in pseudo-random number generator. And I think I mentioned this before. In most real-world programming applications, you don't need to use the random number generator, but it is pretty handy when you're learning to program. So we're going to use that. Um, so the computer uses the random number generator. The user will either input heads or tails, just by whatever decision-making process they want to use, or they actually could flip a coin. So number three, then the program will compare the output of these, or compare these two, and then output the appropriate message as to whether there was a match or not. We might add some different functionality to this later on, and see where we can go with it. So I think one thing that a lot of students do wrong when they're learning how to program is they attempt to write the whole program at once. And I don't think that's a good plan, and I don't do it that way. So let me show you what I did for this. First, I did a little thinking on this, and I looked at number two here. One thing you have to remember is that although the user, being a human, can think about heads and tails, ultimately the computer only thinks about numbers. So I'm thinking what we're going to need to do here is use this pseudo-random number generator to generate either a 0 or a 1. And one of these we'll let represent heads, and one of them we'll let represent tails. And it doesn't really matter which one we let represent heads and which one we do let represent tails. We just have to be consistent. So that was some thinking I did beforehand. So whenever I'm writing a program, I try to identify some minimal functionality that that I can implement and test, and then I start adding things to this minimum functionality. So in this case here, let me show you what I've done. And this is just a text editor. This is Notepad++. Version 1, I'll just copy this over into Visual Studio and show you. We'll talk about it over here. So these are the using statements I need, and this, of course, is my namespace. And I could just, I think it's a good idea to put your initials in here, at least while you're developing. And once I get this finished, I'm going to add several more comments here. So here's my main method. And I've got a couple of integers declared here, and these are going to be used as arguments for the random number generator function. And I'm going to need a string for the user input, and I don't even use it in this version, but it's there. So we'll use that later. And notice I do get a warning down here in the error list that the variable user input is declared but never used. It will be next version. So here I use the built-in random, pseudo-random function, and I declare my own instance of this called rand number generator. And I could have just said num equals new random, but that doesn't tell you anything, does it? So try to use realistic and descriptive variable names here. Um, so after I declare an instance of this, I can use it, of course. So I declare another variable here called computer generated heads tails, and I go on and use the instance of the random number generator to initialize that with the arguments of min and max plus 1. And remember up here the min and max. So here I've declared another integer, and I've named it computer generated heads tails, and I'm going to initialize it with the using the random number generator instance, and the arguments here are min and max plus 1. That's what I declared up here. This will give me a number and store it in computer generated heads or tails, and the number is either going to be a 0 or a 1. And to test this, to make sure I've got everything set up properly here, I put in a couple of if statements, and I could have actually did an if, basically an if-then statement here, but I've split them out for readability purposes. And the read line here is just to keep the console open while I look at the output. So let's save this and run it. So here's my console, and here's an output statement, heads it is. So that indicates to me that the random number generator generated a 0. Now, this is not conclusive, at least in my mind. I'm going to run it again. Heads it is. Well, we saw that a while ago. Still not conclusive. Run it again. Still not conclusive. Run it again. Ah, so we finally get a tails. Now that indicates to me that both of these options are possible, and that my selection of the arguments here for the random number generator are valid. So whenever you're writing a program, you want to think about the different possibilities and test them all as much as possible. A better way of doing this would have been to do some kind of a loop here, and see, I have to run this every time. If you put a basic loop in here, you could have it run, 100 times and see if you got roughly the same number of heads as you did tails. That would have been a pretty good, or a much better indication that this part of the program was correctly written. So I feel pretty good about the part of my program here that's going to use the random number generator, the pseudo random number generator, to generate either a 0 for heads or a 1 for tails. Now let's look at adding some functionality to this. So I'm going to go to my version 2, and we'll copy it over and talk about it. I've added something here to the code that I had before, and if you think about it, it's basically this section right there. So what I did in version 1 is I established that the proper code for the computer to generate either a 0, meaning heads, or a 1, meaning tails. So that's the computer part of the whole process. Now I need to work on what I decided to work on next was this getting the user input in. So this is what I added. I need, of course, a prompt. So for my prompt, are you picking heads or tails? And then I read the input and store it into the user input string. And you'll notice this time there's no error here, that I've got an unused variable. Um, and this time I just echo this back to make sure that my read here is working properly. So these two lines, this is just to verify that everything was read properly, and there's nothing else I need to do there. So let's run this and I'll show you the difference. So now we get a prompt here. Are you picking heads or tails? And I'll just do H for heads. And notice it echoes back, you picked heads, but tails it is. So again, added functionality here. And of course our version 1 is still working properly. So let's go get version 3 now and see what it does. And by the way, it is really a good idea to save these versions as you go, because as your programs get more complicated, it could get to the point where maybe you're looking at this code here and you think, I need to put all this in a loop and maybe put some sort of counter in, and et cetera, et cetera. And maybe after you do that, the thing doesn't work and you can't remember exactly what you did, but now it's broken. If you'd have saved this version, you could always go back to a known good version and start, well, you're not starting over, you're starting at a known good position, which is much better than starting completely over. So let's go back over here and we will insert version 3 and see what it does. So let's see here, the number, here's the generated number, here's the little prompt. We had this before, that's where the program just says it's heads or tails. This is what I've added. And by the way, eventually we will probably remove those lines there, eventually. But right now, I'm still going to leave them in. This is what I've added with version 3. An if, basically an if then else, although C# doesn't actually write out the word then. Look at what I've got here. If user input, which by the way is a string, matches an uppercase T, and I had to put that in quotations, and that's what the two ampersands mean. That's a logical and. The computer generated heads tails, remember this is an int right there. If that's equal to 1, right line you matched. Okay. Else, we're going to try a different case. If the user input is the string with capital H and the computer generated heads tails is 0, which is what we're letting indicate heads, right, output you matched. If neither one of these cases are true, this output, sorry, you didn't match. And if you're thinking I could have put heads first and then tails here, that works as well. There's no real reason I did it this way. But that's what these added lines are going to do for me here. So let's run those. So here's our prompt. Capital H. You picked H. Tails it is. Sorry you didn't match. Now this is another one of the situations I think that you need to try this several times and make sure you see all the possibilities. So we'll do it again. I'm going to pick H again. Same thing we got the first time. Run it again. H. Tails. Having a run of tails here. H. Ah, see, now I've solved the other case. So I feel good that the program is working and picking each of the two options. Now, um, one more thing you might want to look at here is, and this is something that I think students don't appreciate as much as they should. When you write a program, computer program, you have an idea of how it works. And you tend to, when you're testing it, give it inputs that you are, um, at least consciously, probably subconsciously, uh, knowing that's going to work with. So you need to try other things. So if I input a lowercase h here, I didn't match that obviously. Let's try that again. Lowercase h. Now, notice that although I picked lowercase h, which you would assume indicates heads, and the computer picked heads, I get a message, sorry that I didn't match, because if you look at my code here, it was looking specifically for an uppercase H. So we need to add something here to handle that case, and I'll show you what that looks like in a moment. And another thing that we will eventually lead up to here, sooner or later, it may be sooner. What if I input 3? Or even, let's try this. What if I input a 1, which at least in parts of the program indicates tails, but that didn't work, did it? Because that's not the way our conditional here is set up. We're looking for just the uppercase T. So we need to make an adjustment here, and we also need to think about, and I'll save that for later, the whole idea of we need to make sure that the only inputs we get, the only inputs that we evaluate here are inputs that are valid. And we'll talk about that later, how you would, there's several ways you would do that. We'll talk about that later. So let me show you how you would fix at least part of this problem. You need to go to version 4. So here's what I've added. This conditional will check to see if user input is a capital T, the string character, capital T, or, and that's what these are called vertibars, and they're above the enter key. They're on the same key on the keyboard that the backslash is on. So it's shift backslash, you get these vertibars. That's a logical OR. So either a capital T or a lowercase t. So that's the user input part of this, and I put this in parentheses to make sure that this is evaluated first, and then we go on to the logical AND we had before, and then what the computer generated. Same thing for heads. We're going to check for uppercase, an uppercase H or a lowercase h, and then we're going to AND that with whatever's been stored in computer generated heads tails to determine whether we matched or not. So this solves one of the problems, and you could we could actually add, let me show you how this works. I was going to say we could actually add the actual string TAILS if we wanted to require the user to type out the whole thing. Usually we don't. So I input a lowercase t, tails it is, and notice that my code determined that was a match. And as I said before, probably should try this several times to make sure everything works like you think it should. Okay, no match there, which you didn't expect it to match. So there's the match with the lowercase h. So whenever you're writing these conditionals here to determine whether something is a match or not, consider all the different inputs that the user could legitimately input. And I'll leave it to you to try some different ones here if you want to. More generally, we probably, and we'll talk about this later, we need to put something else with this code to check for example, non-numeric inputs. And we'll worry about that in a different time. But you might have heard of instances of computer programs or computer applications having bugs, and these bugs being exploited by hackers. And this is one of the things that happens. There'll be a user input, and the programmer assumes the user is going to input certain things or certain types of things, and the attacker will input something else. And if the program doesn't properly deal with this unexpected input in certain situations, you can compromise the program such that the hacker can get some elevated control of the computer that's running the code. So input checking is a big deal. At worst, if you don't do proper input checking, you're going to have a situation where the user can break your program. At worst, you can have a situation where an attacker can actually use your program to compromise the computer or the device that it's running on. So checking user input is a big deal, and we'll talk more about that later. So for the time being, what I want you to get from this is I didn't try to write this whole program at once. I wrote it in steps. I picked out the least thing I could think of. In this case, I picked, can you generate a 0 or a 1? And I added to it one step at a time, and I kept copies of all my versions, so I could always go back to a known good position here in case something goes wrong. And another thing I did is I tried as I went along here to try all the different options. For example, this section here, I tried inputting an H and separately a T to see that both options were getting in, and that's a pretty simple case there. If you recall, this code here on version 1 just indicated to me that my random number generator was capable of generating 0s and 1s. And as I mentioned earlier, we can probably just comment that out. And that's not unusual in programming, to put in statements that you use while you're writing the program that you're going to delete in the production version. So, and a lot of times those statements are some sort of output statement, so you can see what the program is doing at that time. So I'm confident I can comment these out or delete them entirely. I'll leave it in for the time being. So what else did I want you to see here? As far as user inputs here, a capital T or a lowercase t um, would be inputs that you would expect. And you might want to go back and change this. By the way, the final version probably wouldn't even need that. You might want to change this, the prompt statement here, to say something. I'll just put it as a comment. Something like pick H or H for heads, you know, similar thing for tails. So having a more specific prompt here would help to guide the user to the appropriate input, but that's not necessarily a total guarantee. But it will certainly help. So that's another thing to think about. So I think there are several interesting ideas here in this relatively simple program. Number one, do one thing at a time. Number two, keep your versions where you can come back if you have a problem. Come back to a known good version. Number three, you can put in statements that they output, the output of which you can use to basically make sure that your program is doing what you want, and then you can take these out later. I think we can take all those out. Another thing to remember is, as you go, and particularly on the final version, try to test every possible type of input you can think of. It's always going to be better for you to break your program rather than putting it out there and letting somebody else break it. And more on this later. So, a lot of interesting concepts here concerning computer programming. Probably one of the big things is what I started out with. I don't write the whole program at once. I pick out some minimal part, get it working, save that, add something else to it, verify that works, then move on to add something else till I get it to where I want it. Now I've already thought of a few things I could add to this, you know, kind of make it more, even more bulletproof. But just do everything in stages. Don't try to write the whole thing at once. So think about all these things, and hopefully this will help make you a more proficient programmer.